Alexander Isak is training alone in Spain with his future up in the air. The Newcastle striker told the club he wants time to consider his future with interest from Liverpool. Let's go live to St James's Park and our reporter Keith Downey. Good afternoon. Are Newcastle aware of this then, Keith?
Yeah, Rob, they are aware that Alexander Isak is over in San Sebastian training, recovering on his own. Look, I know the optics of this aren't great from the outside looking in, but look, if anyone who covers the club and knows how Alexander operates, it's not a surprise that he's working with his own team. He's got a team of sports scientists, physicians, a doctor who all help him. And a number of times when he's been injured over the past couple of years, he's actually travelled away from the UK to go and recover with them, and it's something we've actually spoken to Eddie Howe before in his news conferences, and Eddie Howe said, look, they're aware of it and they work in conjunction with Alexander Isak's team. So I'm not that surprised, because you have to remember that the Newcastle first team squad, the management team, the backroom staff, the physios, club doctor, they're all over right now in South Korea as part of Newcastle's pre-season tour. But obviously, as I say, the optics of it aren't great. The fact that Isak, he could be here with his team in Newcastle, but instead he's chosen to be with his team recovering in the Basque region of Spain. So of course he's had to fly there, and one of the reasons given to us was why he didn't fly to Singapore and then on to South Korea was that it wouldn't be beneficial for him being on a long haul flight. But he's managed to travel there to recover from this thigh injury that he has, this minor thigh injury that was quoted by the club just over a week ago when they headed out to Singapore. So look, I think a lot of the Newcastle fans upset and angry about this because it appears that he's checked out, but I would expect Alexander Isak back here in the northeast next week when Newcastle return from their pre-season tour to sit down. He'll have talks with Eddie Howe, and then I guess they'll take it from there. So yeah, he's away from the northeast, trying to get his body in the right place, probably trying to get his mind in the right place, with so much speculation surrounding him off the back of that informal approach from Liverpool 2 weeks ago. And then what we heard and told you last week was that he told Newcastle he wants to explore a potential move away from the club this summer. So something tells me this isn't the last we've heard of this. More will come from this, I guess, when Alexander Isak returns at the start of next week.
You mentioned Eddie Howe there, Keith, and he is being asked constantly on that tour of Asia that you also touched on about Alexander Isak. Every time he sits down, he said it's not in his full control, but I imagine this will be getting quite frustrating for him.
Yeah, I think the amount of time, you're right, will be frustrating Eddie Howe. I think the logistics of it will be frustrating Eddie Howe. The fact he's across the other side of the world in Seoul in South Korea right now, and very far away from Alexander Isak, who's in San Sebastian at Real Sociedad's training ground. And look, I think it's worth adding at this moment as well to say that he's not training with Real Sociedad. Sociedad are away from the training ground themselves on their own pre-season preparations, and the training ground is empty and he's just using their facilities. Remember, he formerly played for Real Sociedad for 3 years, and Newcastle signed him from them 3 years ago for £63 million. So look, I think Eddie Howe will be frustrated that he can't sit down and talk to Alexander Isak face to face. I think that was part of the frustration when they jetted out there over a week ago and he was left behind. There's a vacuum, there's a space, and there's time, but perhaps maybe that time will help matters. Maybe it'll give Isak a bit of time to reflect on things, and I do expect us to get a resolution one way or the other soon. I would be surprised if this one drags on right until the end of the transfer window due to the figures, the money that's involved, eye-watering sums of money. It's not the sort of transfer I would expect to go through in transfer deadline day. So I think everyone involved here at Newcastle will want some kind of resolution to this one way or the other fairly swiftly, and that's why I feel it's key at the start of next week when both Newcastle return from South Korea and Alexander Isak returns from Spain. But you can just looking at Eddie Howe and his body language, it looks as though he's got the weight of the world on his shoulders at the moment. And remember Eddie Howe was in hospital not so long ago with a problem of his own, so he probably needs to look after himself as much as anything else at the moment.
You spoke there about eye-watering sums of money. Real Sociedad would stand to receive a little bit of that if Isak was to be sold.
Yeah, well, the sums that are being quoted, I mean, my understanding is that Newcastle would not sell, well, they don't want to sell Alexander Isak. Of course they don't. He's one of the best strikers in the world. But if he was to go, it would take an offer of around £150 million, which of course is a Premier League record. So a huge sum of money. Remember, Newcastle paid, as I mentioned earlier, 58 plus 5, so £63 million package for Isak's services 3 years ago. Sociedad would stand to make 10% of anything over £60 million. So if Isak was to go for £150 million, they would stand to make 10% of that £90 million profit. So look, they've got an eye on the situation as well. He's clearly got a good relationship with the club, and that is why they've allowed him to use his training facilities over in San Sebastian. I guess everyone here at Newcastle United will just be hoping that he comes back in a better frame of mind and a better shape physically than he was when the club travelled out to Singapore on the first step of that pre-season tour just over a week ago.
How realistic would it be if Newcastle did need to replace him, that Benjamin Sesko would be the player they could sign?
Yeah, look, I mean, it was clear that Hugo Ekitike was the player that he wanted. Instead, he went to Liverpool. I think Sesko is a player that they also hugely admire, and he would be a real option for them. I think it would be difficult for Newcastle to even consider allowing Alexander Isak to leave without a high-end striker to come in and replace him, and I include Benjamin Sesko in that. Look, if Newcastle were to manage to bring Sesko to the football club, you would suggest that would open the door for Alexander to leave if Liverpool put a bid in that's accepted by Newcastle. And of course I've already quoted the figures that Newcastle are looking for, but of course Newcastle a little bit wary, I think, that Manchester United are also keen on Sesko, and they've had their fingers burned a number of times already this summer. By my last count, round about 8 players they've gone for and have chosen to go elsewhere. So they keep losing out to other clubs, big clubs of course. They've already lost out to Manchester United for Bryan Mbeumo, and I think it'd be a really difficult one for them to take if they were to lose out on Sesko as well. And you think if they were to lose Sesko to Manchester United, that would then have ramifications in terms of what they do with Alexander Isak, because there is no way Newcastle United would even consider allowing Alexander Isak to leave if they don't have a replacement and a top-end replacement lined up to come in and replace him. So look, it's going to be a really interesting couple of weeks. As I say, I don't think it's going to go right on until the end of the window, but I feel as though we're going to get a little bit more on this next week once Isak returns, Newcastle return, and they can all sit down and speak to each other face to face.
Thank you very much.
The move for Isak doesn't necessarily rule out a move for a centre-back. I think there are options in the market that have been linked with Liverpool in the past that could still join Liverpool. You know, Mark Gahey, I don't think is too far-fetched. And yes, we would be talking about record amounts of money being spent here, but Liverpool, the way PSR is set up, the way they have worked from a commercial standpoint, the revenue they've taken from trophies, the revenue they've taken in from sales already this summer, which will surpass £150 million. You'd think by the time this window is wrapped up, they're in a position to spend that. So they can go out and sign a centre-back and Isak. And I think what Isak does is it really pushes them from sort of title favourites to, you're looking at this league and thinking, I don't see how Liverpool are stopped. The amount of assets they would have in those forward areas. If Mo Salah is going for a little bit of a down spell, how do you then stop Isak scoring? Ekitike being able to function as a second striker, as a number 9, potentially also slightly wider if he has to. Florian Wirtz, you know, it's almost now, because of the Isak news is so big, we're forgetting that they've spent 120 million on Florian Wirtz. Like, is that just slipping away in people's minds? He's maybe the most exciting young talent in world football that was achievable this summer. I am terrified at the prospect of Liverpool, and I really think this Alexander Isak story feels like it has serious legs. I don't see any other options in the market for him, which I think is a big benefit for Liverpool, and it feels like he's pushed Newcastle into a position where they've got to make a decision on this.